Welcome to Europe and Globe, the podcast that explores today's world and changes the way we look at tomorrow's challenges. You are at a restaurant, and you are enjoying a good steak with fries. When it is time to pay the bill, you take out your beautiful leather wallet and leave the establishment with your suede jacket on your shoulders. But did you ever ask yourself where they come from and what impact they have on deforestation?
In this episode, we will look at the beef, leather, and soy sectors and the implementation of the EU Deforestation-free Regulation. Is this regulation binding on companies in these sectors? Will it lead to additional difficulties for breeders, tanneries, and African soy producers? That is what we will explore together.
Hello, I'm Elodie Ritzenthaler.
Hello, I'm Aysata Thiam-Leonov, and this is a Europe and Globes podcast.
The EU Deforestation-free Regulation, also called EUDR, was adopted in 2023. It becomes mandatory on the 1st of January 2026. And it obliges companies that place meat of cattle, hides and skins, leather, and soya on the EU market to comply with the laws of producing countries on human rights and social and environmental issues. These operators must also provide the GPS coordinates of the plots of origin of the products. All this information will be gathered in a due diligence document, which can be verified by the authorities of the EU member states. In this way, the authorities will be able to check our imports at the port of Constanta, the port of Burgos or Copenhagen, and check that the plots of land on which the cattle has been raised or the soya is harvested have not been deforested since the 31st of December 2020.
Around 85% of the world's livestock farmers are in sub-Saharan Africa. But Africa produces less than 3% of the world's meat and has 14% of the world's livestock.
Ethiopia has the largest cattle herd in Africa, with over 65 million heads of cattle, followed by Chad and Tanzania. However, despite the importance of the cattle sector for African farmers and populations, very few countries export their beef to the European Union. In fact, there are only two, Namibia and Botswana.
But if we focus on African livestock farming, it is essentially extensive, and most livestock farmers on the continent are what we call pastoralists because they practice pastoralism.
Exactly. According to the FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Agency, pastoralism, or transhumance of livestock, is one of the most viable means of subsistence in the arid areas of Africa. It concerns around 270 million people in 36 African countries. There is pastoralism from the West Sahelian countries to the pastures in East Africa and the Horn of Africa to South Africa. Herds travel thousands of kilometers, and transhumance exists since centuries from Mauritania to West Africa to Somalia in the east. This transhumance has many consequences. It makes it difficult to eradicate animal diseases, which can be serious, in particular foot and mouth disease. And this system obviously allows the herds to fetch the resources they need. But this nomadic lifestyle can lead to recurring conflicts between herders and planters, meaning smallholder farmers. It can even lead to regional instability, with herders running thousands of heads of cattle and sometimes armed.
And with climate change, we can see, for example, that the herds in the Sahel regions are increasingly heading south in search of pasture to the coastal countries of West Africa such as Benin, Togo, Côte d'Ivoire, and northern Nigeria, for example.
That's right, Aysata. Just as Chadian herds sometimes reach forest areas in the Central African Republic, northern Cameroon, the DRC, and the countries of the Congo Basin. For several years now, traditional transhumance routes have been changing. They depend on the availability of water and grazing resources, but also on insecurity issues that may arise here or there.
But pastoralism is not the only livestock farming system on the African continent.
True, apart the pastoral and transhuman systems we have just been talking about, there is a second system, which is a mixed cropping and livestock system. Smallholders in most African countries have both a little piece of land that they cultivate and a few heads of cattle. Then there is a third livestock farming system, which is mainly based on big ranches. This system of livestock farming is known as commercial livestock farming.
But in reality, there are relatively few large livestock farms in sub-Saharan Africa. And because there are not that many, the opportunities for exporting to the European Union are rather limited.
Yes, that's right. Animal quality, health, traceability, and services such as slaughterhouses, the cold chain, and packaging are real obstacles to developing international markets and to exporting meat.
But we can see that Middle Eastern countries buy live animals and can be quite significant buyers for some countries on the African continent. So why is it not the case for the European Union?
Well, the EU does not buy live animals from Africa. The European Union has strong health and quality requirements. We also have fairly strict consumer protection policies, and that is something to be welcomed, of course. And in most sub-Saharan African countries, unfortunately, infrastructures and animal disease control are inadequate.
So what about the EU Deforestation-free Regulation and the requirements for livestock traceability systems?
Well, as we can easily understand, beyond the health issues, the overall organization of the sector makes it very difficult to trace livestock in many countries. The geolocation of livestock is an obvious challenge because of the very informal structure of the sector. Even in South Africa, cattle traceability does not yet exist, which is why the country does not export beef to the European Union.
But Namibia is able to do it, and it is one of the few African countries where the livestock sector looks genuinely productive and export-oriented.
Yes, you are right. This is the case for Namibia, and to a lesser extent for Botswana. And Namibia is even one of the top 10 beef exporters to the EU. We bought 40 million euros worth of beef from Namibia in 2023, meaning half of its meat exports.
How can we explain this situation?
Namibia has set up a veterinary fence that almost cuts the country in two. So it prevents transhumance of herds, and it is designed to protect cattle from foot and mouth disease. The beef exported to Europe is produced on land to the south of this fence, where there are no forests. These are known as grasslands. The beef comes exclusively from large ranches, which often covers between 5 and 10,000 hectares.
Wow, any breeder in Europe would find this really amazing.
Yes, that's for sure, because ranches are huge. And then the beef industry is relatively well organized in Namibia and complies with European quality requirements and health standards. Already in 1991, antibiotics have been banned from Namibian cattle farms. And DG Senko, the European Commission's Directorate General for Health and Food Safety, carries out health checks every year and validates Namibian abattoirs that can export. Only 2 of them can do so. Namibia also has good animal identification and traceability systems, with cattle that, like ours, have an ear tag system and the equivalent of a barcode or QR code that tells you where they come from, where they were reared, and so on. This system was launched in Namibia in 2006.
Namibian beef should therefore comply with the EU Deforestation-free Regulation, as it also meets strict social and environmental regulations. And the farms are in the south of this veterinary fence where there is no forest, so they cannot contribute to deforestation.
Yes, that is exactly the situation. And the only thing that could be problematic is if the cattle are fed with soya, because traceability is also required for this product in the EU Deforestation-free Regulation. Normally, it is not the case. Cattle graze naturally on Namibia's grasslands, but with the country's recurrent droughts, breeders sometimes need to supplement their feed.
That's it for beef meat. So we understand why it is difficult or even impossible for most sub-Saharan African countries to export to the European Union. And now, if we have a look to the hides and the skin sector, once again, few countries are exporting to the EU.
Well, firstly, hides are not highly valued on the continent. The main industrial tanneries are in South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, but there are also tanneries in Ethiopia and Nigeria. In sub-Saharan Africa, even though the livestock population is very large, most of it is not killed in official slaughterhouses that meet strict health criteria. And in addition, many hides are of poor quality because the animals are not fed properly. The hides are damaged because the cattle are bitten by insects, which makes holes in the hide. They injure themselves on bushes or fences, and so on. And also, the hides are often not collected, or they are collected by very informal operators who do not really know how to preserve them before selling them to a tannery. And finally, the salting of the hides can also be poorly done. So in short, we are facing many situations that result in the hides being of poor quality.
Then probably all these factors are holding back the development of the hides and skin sector.
Yes, indeed. And the biggest industrial tanneries in South Africa and the Maghreb countries also have to import hides, sometimes even from South America, because if they only buy the hides locally, they do not have enough quantities and the quality is not always optimal.
And in addition, tanneries can be quite polluting.
Yes, that is true. And along with the issues of labor costs, it is one of the reasons why there are very few tanneries left in the European Union today. And those that still exist make very high quality leather and have highly specialized skills. There are some left, mainly in Italy, very few in France, and there are still some in Spain and Portugal, and Eastern European countries such as Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. The environmental impact of tanneries can be very negative if they are poorly equipped and do not have access to adequate inputs, particularly chemicals. Chromium is also extremely polluting, and wastewater is still often not treated in many tanneries on the African continent. For hides and skins, the Deforestation-free Regulation requires to identify where and when the cattle were slaughtered, and with a very informal hide collection system in most African countries, it is not certain that operators can fully meet this requirement in South Africa, Ethiopia, and elsewhere.
But isn't there a certification system in the leather sector, as in other sectors, that could help companies align with the EU Deforestation-free Regulation?
Well, there is no certification for livestock farming. There is one for leather. It is called the Leather Working Group. And it has defined indicators to certify all the players in the leather supply chain, from raw leather to finished product, from micro-entreprises to large tanneries. But as I said it already, the hides and skins received by tanneries on the African continent do not always come from formal slaughterhouses, and that is the difficulty. Knowing where and when the cattle were slaughtered can really be problematic for many tanneries. And if they want to sell leather and cowhides to the European Union after 2026, we will need to have this information. Where do the hides processed in the tanneries of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, or of Marrakesh in Morocco come from? Yes, tanneries will have to provide this information.
So what will happen? Will tanneries in Africa with customers in Europe no longer be able to export to the EU after January 1st, 2026?
Well, some of them are going to run into difficulties, losing some of their customers and sales, and there could, of course, be social consequences.
All this does not sound very optimistic for the leather industry. And now let's move on to the soy sector. The situation is probably different, and the African continent is currently a small producer of soy.
True, only around 1% of the world's soya production is harvested in Africa. Brazil is by far number one, with 40% of the world's soya production. The United States accounts for almost 30%, and Argentina 15%. So 3 countries together produce around 85% of the world's soya.
European countries import over 90% of their soy consumption, i.e. almost 40 million tons a year, in the form of oil cakes or soy residues mainly. And it is true to say that Africa is not yet a key player in soy production, but things could change.
The European Union buys 20% of the world's soya production. mainly from the United States, Brazil, Ukraine, and Canada. But with the demand for soya rising sharply worldwide, and because of the high cost of agricultural inputs for maize, rice, and other crops, African producers are increasingly turning to soya, which requires relatively less fertilizer than other crops. So at the moment, Africa's consumption of soya is rather limited. As we said it before, the continent's livestock is fed mainly on pasture. But soya is a commodity that is increasingly in demand, and it is a source of protein not only for animals but also for human beings. Soya can also be used to make biofuels, plastics, and cosmetics. These are new and growing markets.
On the African continent, South Africa is the biggest soy producer, followed by Nigeria and Zambia. Soy is also grown in a number of other countries, such as Benin, but Togo is the main African exporter of soy to the EU.
Yes, indeed. It is quite surprising because in terms of volumes, this country is a small soya producer. But it has concentrated on organic soya and has become the EU's leading supplier of organic soya, ahead of India and Ukraine, which seems quite incredible. Also, operators who are organic certified, meaning EcoCert, according to the European certification, already meet social and environmental obligations. And EcoCert now requires all certified products exported to the EU from 2025 onwards to comply with the EU Deforestation-free Regulations obligations and the geolocation of plots. So, Togolese operators are on the right track to comply with the EU new requirements.
Okay for Togo and organic soy. Let's go now to South Africa, which is the main producer of soy in Africa. There, soy does not contribute to deforestation either. South Africa is a country where the primary forests are very well preserved and where the forest plantations are managed sustainably.
Yes, in South Africa, soya is an important rotation crop with maize, rapeseed, and wheat, and the local demand is stable. However, the country expects its production to double over the next 5 years thanks to improved seeds and farming practices and the use of GMOs.
Let's go now to Nigeria, where most soy production is consumed locally. The country exports mainly soy oil cakes and residues to Europe.
Well, as you know, Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, and livestock farming is a very significant sector. The city of Kano in the north of the country has the largest livestock market in West Africa. The soya sector is growing and is also receiving some support from the United States, or at least it was the situation until now. On the other hand, it is difficult to know whether the Nigerian soya contributes to the deforestation in the country. But it is likely that the big operators are setting up their due diligence systems, tracing their production and monitoring their social and environmental indicators.
If I understand correctly, operators already have due diligence systems aligned with the social and environmental indicators of the EU Deforestation-free Regulation. Apparently, they did not wait for the EU regulation to introduce best practices.
Yes, they have been pushed by some consumers and NGOs, particularly in Brazil, because soya has had a major impact on deforestation in the Amazon. The major companies in the sector launched the Soft Commodities Forum initiative to develop a common framework for supplier traceability in regions at high risk of deforestation and fire. In addition, the European Feed Manufacturers Federation, or FEFAC, drew up some guidelines on soya sourcing already in 2015, enabling the definition of approaches to combat deforestation, promote sustainable farming practices and fair working conditions. And the indicators and tools used by companies in Europe, Brazil, or the United States are quite logically used in other soya-producing countries, including Africa.
But you say that soy production is increasing very fast because of growing international demand and the profitability of the sector. So I imagine that while soy currently does not contribute to African deforestation, perhaps the situation will change?
Yes, you are right. It is possible that soya will contribute a little more to deforestation in Africa, if domestic production develops for local markets or for international buyers who are not involved on sustainability issues.
Okay, let's go back to the beginning of this episode and your leather wallet and suede jacket.
Yes, let's do that. But we could also talk about your shoes or your handbag. There is still something quite incomprehensible in the EU Deforestation-free Regulation. I will give you an example. An Indian or Chinese company that buys African leather and manufactures shoes in Asia to sell them in the EU does not have to prove that its supply chain is sustainable and to provide data on where and when the cattle were slaughtered. On the other hand, a shoe manufacturer based in Europe who buys cowhides has to provide this information about the animals from which the skins were taken. In short, I think it is crazy and really unfair. I even think that, in a way, we are sabotaging ourselves. It seems very illogical.
You're right, and it is important to speak up. Okay, we'll stop now on the African beef, leather, and soy sectors. Thanks, Elodie.
Thank you, Aisata.
In the next episode, we will look at the timber and wood sector with logs, furniture, charcoal, or even pulp and paper.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.